They say you don't truly know a person until the stakes are high enough to unravel them. In my case, I married a man who dressed his confidence in tailored suits and wore certainty like cologne. And I, the dutiful wife, believed in the architecture of our dreams brick by brick, bill by bill. Until one day I saw what I had really built was not a home, but a house of cards balanced on the silence of my own sacrifices. My name is Elise Whitmore. I was 24 when I married Jonathan. I still remember the way he smiled when he handed me the pen at the bank, his thumb grazing my fingers as I signed our first joint account papers. "You're brilliant, but leave the money talk to me," he'd said. And I, young and loyal, thought love meant trust. He managed our finances while I managed everything else, the dinners, the holidays, the quiet stitching together of a life I assumed we shared. He was charming in public, but dismissive in private. My interest in finance was a nuisance, my questions met with laughter or the kind of silence that chills even in summer. Once, during a dinner party, I'd offered a thought on equity markets. He cut me off with a toast, raising his glass to the room. "To Elise, proof that beauty and budgets don't mix." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. The bitter kind, the polite kind. But I didn't stop asking. I just stopped asking him. Instead, I studied in the early mornings, coffee in one hand and textbooks in the other. I downloaded spreadsheets and watched investment tutorials with headphones while he watched late-night poker streams. I opened my own accounts. Quiet ones. Secure ones. In my name only. I tracked his habits, his credit card swipes, the suspicious business ventures. The new car he said was for both of us. The cracks began to show like stress fractures in porcelain. Late bills. Calls from unknown numbers. Excuses about business cycles and temporary liquidity issues. I smiled, cooked dinner, and listened. And all the while, I studied. The day the bank came to seize the house, he looked at me like I was supposed to panic. Like I would cry or beg or run to my parents. But I only tilted my head and asked calmly, "Is this the only asset you've forgotten to secure?" He blinked, confused. Because while he played his reckless hand, I had learned the game. I had traced the deeds, the equity, the write-offs. I had taken the dismissed, forgotten fragments of our shared life and restructured them into something entirely my own. That afternoon, I packed a single suitcase and drove to my villa. He had mocked my interest in finance, said women had no place in the world of numbers and deals. But numbers, unlike men, don't lie. His empire was built on illusion. Mine? On silence, study, and the strength he never thought I had. The villa stood in contrast to the life I had just left behind. Nestled in the hills outside Florence, its stone walls bore witness to centuries of survival, weathered storms, wars, collapses. Much like me. I stepped through the front doors, the scent of lavender and old wood greeting me like a long-lost friend. It wasn't opulent, but it was mine. Purchased under a trust he'd laughed off as too complicated to bother with, using assets he had claimed were no longer valuable. In truth, they were undervalued, hidden behind his arrogance and my invisibility. It had taken months to move them quietly. I'd watched him write off certain holdings during his quarterly tax purge, tossing them aside like expired coupons. To him, they were losses. To me, they were opportunities. I used shell companies, simple, legal, clever, to purchase the liens, then converted them into real estate and stocks while he stayed distracted with illusionary profits. I never told him what I was doing. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because he wasn't just careless, he was cruel in that slow, eroding way that's hard to explain but easy to feel. The kind that calls your ambition cute and your intelligence a phase. He mocked me into silence, never realizing I was taking notes the entire time. I'd kept a ledger. Not the kind kept in spreadsheets or secure drives, but a mental one. I recorded every insult masked as advice. Every eye roll when I spoke about diversifying assets. Every patronizing pat on the hand when I mentioned global inflation. The ledger held more than transactions. It held betrayal, mine and his. There were nights I would lie awake beside him, listening to the soft snore of a man too sure of himself. He slept like someone who believed the world owed him comfort. And I, still awake, would run numbers in my head, calculating not just compound interest, but escape velocity. When the final notice came, the foreclosure on the Boston house, I didn't blink. He stood in the kitchen, phone to his ear, voice raised. He was furious, as if the world had failed him. I poured my tea slowly and said nothing. "Elise, say something," he shouted. I looked up from my mug and asked, "Did you ever think to ask me what I was building?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he never saw me. Not when I stayed up late balancing our bills. Not when I quietly took out certificates in my name. Not when I earned my financial planning license on nights he said I was wasting my time. He thought he'd married someone who would forever orbit his star. But I was always my own son. No one had ever taught me how to outmaneuver a man like Jonathan. Not in school, not in family dinners where silence was the expected language for women. But betrayal is its own curriculum, and over the years, I'd earned my education in increments. Not from professors, but from the humiliation he dished out in boardrooms and banter. It began with the courses he mocked. "Financial analysis? That's adorable," he'd said when I first enrolled. "Why don't you take a cooking class instead? Something useful." I smiled tightly and said nothing. I learned early that silence was my sanctuary, the only place he couldn't follow. He underestimated what silence can do. It sharpens. It listens. It collects. By day, I played the supportive wife. I attended his client events in perfect heels, smiled when he recited the same story about how he rescued a startup with a brilliant acquisition. I knew he took credit for deals other people structured. I also knew which shell accounts he used to transfer risk away from his name. The secrets were all there if you listened. By night, I read textbooks and memorized tax codes. I learned to interpret financial statements the way some women decipher love letters. Debits and credits became poetry to me, evidence of choices made, lies told, lives balanced precariously. Eventually, I took the Series 65 exam and passed on the first try. I never told him. It became a kind of secret power, watching him posture in meetings while I silently reviewed his portfolio in my mind, noting the leverage, the exposure, the gaps. He thought he was educating me by osmosis, letting me tag along to his firm's annual retreats. What he didn't realize was that I was learning, yes, but not from him. I was learning what not to be. His firm's CFO once pulled me aside at a gala. "You're sharp," she said. "You ever consider getting licensed?" I'd smiled. "Already am." She raised her glass. "Smart woman." And I remember thinking, yes, but quiet about it. For now. I opened my first solo account 6 months later. Funded it with returns from the property I bought using a refinanced policy he didn't think to check. I diversified, low-risk real estate, medium-yield ETFs, some venture capital. My name was on every document. I learned how to make myself invisible in the system while becoming unshakably present in reality. Every asset he thought was gone? Reclaimed. Every account he thought drained? Rebuilt. Every time he thought I was losing? I was preparing. You don't win by yelling. You win by building. Quietly. Precisely. Relentlessly. And by the time the final bill came due on his mismanaged empire, I wasn't just prepared. I was already living the life he believed only he deserved. It was a slow afternoon in the villa, the kind that invited reflection. The breeze curled through open shutters, bringing the scent of rosemary from the garden. I sat at the long oak table in the study, his study, once, now repurposed, reclaimed. In front of me, papers, ledgers, and one small envelope marked in Jonathan's handwriting, private. I hadn't opened it during the move. I hadn't needed to. But now? Now I wanted to see what secrets he considered too sacred for me to find. Inside were 3 things: a failed business loan application, a letter from his father, and a note, and signed, unsent, written to someone named Margot. My hands didn't shake. Not even a little. The loan application had been denied, not for lack of income, but for dishonesty. He had falsified projections, inflated numbers, and attached forged documents from a non-existent client. The same project he had claimed was a temporary cash flow dip was actually a lie wrapped in charm. I remembered the night he told me about that deal. He was pouring us wine, smug in that way he often was when discussing money. "We'll bounce back," he said. "You don't need to understand the details." But I had, and now I had the proof. The letter from his father was a surprise. Cold. Impersonal. "You were raised to know better," it read. "Your decisions are your own now. Do not expect me to clean them up." It explained something I'd long suspected. Jonathan's empire wasn't self-made. It was inherited, mismanaged, and then recast in his mind as genius. But even the hand that had fed him had grown weary. Then there was the note. The one to Margot. "I'm sorry about Elise," it began. That was the only part one read. I folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Not because it hurt, no. It confirmed what I already knew. I was a placeholder. A silhouette of stability he never expected would step forward into the light. But I had. And I wasn't interested in his apologies. Not to me. Not to another woman. That day, I called my attorney in Boston. "I want to move forward with the final filings," I said. "You're sure?" she asked, gently. "You're in a strong position, Elise. No rush." But I didn't want a strong position. I wanted a clean slate. "I'm sure." Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about release. It was about walking into a future with nothing owed and nothing held back. And so I signed the documents. Divorce. Asset separation. Quiet, firm closure. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, stepped out onto the terrace, and watched the sun dip behind the hills. It was the same sun that had set on 1,000 of his triumphs. Tonight it was mine. There's a kind of silence that heals. Not the silence of being ignored, nor the kind that falls over dinner tables like frost. No, this was the silence of peace, the absence of accusation, of raised voices, of being made to feel like too much and not enough in the same breath. The villa was full of it. That golden, humming silence. It felt like breathing in after holding my breath for years. For the first time in a long while, I was alone without feeling lonely. The stillness wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to stretch. To remember the sound of my own voice when no one was correcting it. Back in the marriage, silence had meant something different. I'd sit across from Jonathan at restaurants, watching him perform. He'd talk and gesture, spinning tales for friends and strangers alike about deals and markets and all the places he'd been. If I interjected, his smile would tighten. "She's brilliant at supporting me," he'd say, dismissing me with a compliment dressed in a cage. I learned to sip my wine and nod. I learned how to disappear without leaving the room. He liked me quiet. He mistook my quiet for smallness. That was his greatest miscalculation. Because while he talked, I studied. While he postured, I positioned. I turned our marriage into a case study in capital mismanagement and asset repurposing. And I was the asset he couldn't value properly. Friends had warned me, subtly. A raised eyebrow, a too long pause when I described our finances, our dynamic. But I had been loyal. And loyalty, unchecked, can turn into self-abandonment. I was done with that now. I spent my mornings walking the gravel paths behind the villa, listening to the earth under my feet. I watched olive branches swaying in the breeze like dancers who knew no audience was needed to move with grace. And every afternoon, I met with women on calls, over coffee, through letters. Women who'd also been dismissed, diminished, doubted. I didn't set out to become a mentor, but they came to me. And when they spoke, I listened. Because I remembered what it felt like to be interrupted at every turn. To be told you're brilliant, but only if that brilliance stays confined to certain corners. Together we began drawing blueprints, not for escape, but for emergence. "Teach me how to start," one woman had written. And I did. in spreadsheets and stock options and strength they didn't know they had. They started calling me La Señora de Numeri, the Lady of Numbers. Jonathan had once called me an expense. Now, women called me an investment. And I never corrected them. Because finally, they were right. I began to collect parts of myself the way one gathers seashells along the shore after a storm, scattered, weathered, but still beautiful. Each one a piece I had once given away too easily. My time, my talents, my trust. Now, I retrieved them from the wreckage and examined them in the clean light of solitude. It's a strange thing, freedom. It doesn't arrive with a flourish or a shout. It seeps in like dawn, quiet, golden, unnoticed until you realize the darkness is gone. One morning, I found myself standing barefoot in the villa's courtyard, watering the lemon trees. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, sun-warmed skin, sleep-soft hair, no makeup, no performance. Just a woman alone, alive and whole. For so many years, I had measured myself by Jonathan's mood. His approval was currency, and I had spent myself down to nothing trying to earn it. He had made himself the sun around which I orbited. But he was no sun, just a flickering bulb that convinced me I'd never seen real light. When the court documents arrived confirming the divorce, I expected to feel something big. Relief. Triumph. Rage. But I only felt still. It was done. No parade, no final blowout. Just a soft closing of a chapter that had already ended long before the ink dried. My attorney had included a note. You came out stronger than any of us predicted. Well done. I didn't feel strong, not in the cinematic sense. I felt steady, anchored. That was enough. I celebrated alone that night. A glass of Prosecco. Fresh bread, still warm from the village bakery. Soft music playing, something instrumental and melancholy. I didn't want to forget what I'd survived. I wanted to remember it the way one remembers the scar that saved them. Not with pain, but with clarity. I opened the drawer where I kept the old life, photos, documents, receipts from a marriage that felt like a performance I'd exited mid-scene. I burned them, slowly, in the fireplace. Not in anger. In gratitude. Because even in that ruin, I'd found the roadmap home. Home to myself. It arrived in the early evening, just as the last light was draping the hills in bronze. An email from Jonathan. Subject line. One last thing. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it like it was a ghost come to knock at my new door, one I'd locked with care. I made tea. I checked the lemon trees. I watched a lizard sun itself on the wall outside the veranda. And then, when the silence had wrapped around me like armor, I clicked. The message was short. Elise. I underestimated you. I see that now. You were always smarter than I gave you credit for. I don't know whether to hate you or admire you. Maybe both. I lost everything. Hope it was worth it. Jay. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. He wanted me to respond, to soothe, to apologize, maybe even to gloat. But I had nothing left to give him. His loss wasn't mine. It never had been. He'd lost everything because he gambled on the wrong equation. That charm outranks character. That confidence excuses cowardice. That silence equals surrender. And I had only ever wanted partnership. Not dominance. Not control. Not a crown. Just a hand that saw mine as equal. I remembered the look on his face the day I left. It wasn't anger. It was confusion. He truly hadn't believed I would go. He believed in the version of me he'd created, compliant, impressed, indebted. He didn't see the woman who had studied markets by moonlight, who turned every slight into strategy, who smiled when the bank took his house because she'd already claimed her own. I poured the rest of my tea and walked out onto the terrace. The sky was turning the color of crushed violets. Somewhere below, I heard music, accordion and guitar, laughter carried up by the wind. Jonathan's final note wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. He had finally seen me, but only in the rear view. And me? I'd stopped looking back. It was my first time hosting since everything unraveled. A modest affair, 6 women, a table set beneath the pergola, and candlelight flickering against wine glasses filled with something old and Italian. No one wore masks here. Not the decorative kind, nor the invisible ones we used to wear in boardrooms and bedrooms, marriages and meetings. These were women who had all, in some shape or form, come through fire. There was Anna, a software engineer from Lisbon who had been ousted from her startup by the very team she built. Camille, a sommelier once married to a man who bought vineyards to impress his clients, but never learned how to taste. June, an artist who had been told for years her work was too intense for the market until it sold out in Tokyo. And me, Elise, the accountant turned advisor turned escapee from a story too many women know but not enough tell. We talked in layers, starting with travel and wine, then folding into confessions like petals unfurling. Camille asked the question first, over a shared bite of fig and goat cheese. What was the moment you knew you were done? Not with the relationship. With pretending. I swallowed slowly, the memory surfacing not with pain, but with precision. There was a morning, I said, when he called the accountant about an asset he thought he owned. And she said, "Oh, that's been transferred months ago." I paused. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. And he was. Anna smiled into her glass. You rewrote the story while he was still narrating the old one. Yes, I said. Exactly that. There were no cheers. No gasps. Just nods of recognition. Because we all knew how it felt to be underestimated until we weren't. To be the background character until the plot changed and we owned the pen. That night, after they'd gone, I lingered under the stars. The scent of rosemary and grilled peaches still clung to the air. I looked up at the sky, vast and silent, like a ledger finally balanced. There had been so many nights during the marriage where I wondered if I was imagining it. The erasure. The subtle theft of self. But now I knew. I had been right all along. And my quiet, steady war had turned into peace. Not with him. With myself. They found me slowly, one message at a time. First was Mara, a woman I barely remembered from a gala 5 years ago. She had been draped on Jonathan's arm that night, laughing too loudly at his stories, wearing a dress far too brave for winter. I dismissed her then, writing it off as another flirtation he swore meant nothing. She messaged me on a Tuesday. Elise, you don't know me. Not really. But I knew him. And I owe you an apology. He made me believe you were the villain. Controlling. Cold. He said you refused to support his dreams. He didn't say you were the one funding them. I'm sorry. I was young and stupid. I didn't see it then. I see it now. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not in pain. In recognition. Because for years, I'd been painted in the corner of his stories as the obstacle to his brilliance. I had been the excuse for every failure, the shadow he claimed he couldn't outrun. More messages came. Not all romantic. Some were business partners. Some were acquaintances. A few were women I'd once smiled at across tables, not knowing they were being fed the same narrative he fed me in reverse. Elise doesn't believe in me. Elise doesn't understand vision. Elise spends too much. That one had made me laugh when I read it. The only thing I ever spent recklessly on was love. And even that was an investment I wouldn't repeat. But I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need their guilt. I needed only what I had already claimed: my peace, my clarity, my future. Still, it shook something loose in me. A thought I hadn't voiced aloud until that point. What if I used it? Not the scandal. Not the past, but the blueprint. The knowledge I had acquired silently, methodically, about money, deception, and escape. I had turned a dismantled life into something sovereign. Could I help other women do the same? That question stayed with me for days. Until one morning, standing in the courtyard, I opened my laptop and began drafting the first outline. A program. A guide. A quiet revolution. Exit strategies, reclaiming power through financial wisdom. Because the truth is, many women stay not out of love, but out of logistics. and no one had shown them how to leave safely. I would. Not out of vengeance, but because I had been her. And now, I wasn't. It began humbly, just a PDF, 10 pages, no branding, no flourish. I uploaded it to a small private forum for women in transitional spaces. Divorce, career shifts, financial limbo. I titled it The First 5 Moves. Not dramatic, not catchy, just honest. Open your own bank account. Know where the money is. Document everything. Build credit in your name. Say nothing until you're ready. Simple steps. Obvious, maybe, but not when you've been conditioned to equate silence with safety. The response stunned me. Dozens of messages, then hundreds. Women from all walks of life wrote back with gratitude, questions, and stories so eerily familiar I could have written them myself. I didn't know it was okay to keep financial secrets for my safety. My husband monitors all our accounts. This gave me a roadmap. I'm a lawyer, and even I needed this reminder. It became clear that I had struck a vein no one else had dared touch. Because empowerment often came wrapped in slogans and hashtags, but this was bone deep. This was about the freedom to leave, not out of desperation, but from a place of preparedness. I spent nights revising, expanding the guide, transforming it into modules. I added checklists, case studies, scripts for difficult conversations. I brought in experts, attorneys, therapists, digital security consultants. I paid them well, because this wasn't charity. This was infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jonathan once said, "You're not strategic enough to lead." And here I was, quietly building a framework more resilient than anything he ever constructed. My little operation gained traction fast. An anonymous donor, likely one of the women I'd helped, offered funds for a secure platform. I accepted. Discreetly. We launched a membership portal, encrypted and safe. We named it the Silent Ledger. Not because we wanted to stay silent forever, but because many of us had survived by speaking quietly until we could afford to be loud. I gave seminars from my villa, camera off, voice clear. I taught women how to recognize financial gaslighting, how to protect inherited assets, how to legally disappear if they had to. I watched them reclaim their narratives. And somewhere between the 3rd and 4th cohort, I realized something profound. I had once believed my villa was the final triumph, the proof I had won, but now I saw clearly. It wasn't the villa. It was this. Helping others build their exits. Helping them walk toward a life that felt like breath instead of survival. The invitation came in a heavy cream envelope, sealed in wax. An old friend's charity gala in Milan. A gathering of financiers, artists, and executives, people Jonathan once claimed were out of my depth. I hesitated, then RSVP'd yes. Not to prove anything, but because I was no longer afraid of the rooms that once made me feel small. The hotel suite they gave me was lavish, floor-to-ceiling windows, silk linens, champagne on arrival. But I unpacked slowly, deliberately. My armor now wasn't couture. It was calm. The night of the gala, I wore a black dress, with a neckline sharp enough to be a warning. My heels didn't click, they declared. Inside, the ballroom glowed with wealth, but it was the same show I'd seen 100 times. Smiles stretched too wide, laughter meant to impress more than delight. I sipped wine and watched. And then I saw him. Jonathan. Standing near the marble staircase, older somehow, thinner. His suit fit a little looser. His charm hung like an echo of its former self. He saw me, and for a moment, the crowd disappeared. I watched the realization cross his face, not just that I was there, but that I belonged there. On my own terms, by my own making. He didn't approach. But someone else did. A woman in her 50s, sleek and composed. "Elise Whitmore?" she asked. "Yes." I read the silent ledger. "I'm on my 3rd client because of you." She extended her hand. "I'm a financial planner now. After 30 years of being married to a man who kept me in the dark. Your work lit a fire." I smiled. "You lit it." "I just passed the match." The conversation was brief, but it cracked something open. Because it happened again and again. Women approaching me between speeches, during dessert, in the powder room. Not as fans. As equals. As survivors who were now strategists. At one point, I caught Jonathan watching me from across the room. Not with rage or regret. With recognition. He finally saw me. The strategist. The architect. The one who didn't just walk away, but built something after the fall. I lifted my glass to no one in particular. Because this time, the toast was for me. And for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough until she proved she was more. Back in the villa, I thought I'd closed that chapter for good. The part of my life tied to Jonathan's name, his shadow, his story. But the past has a way of circling back, not to haunt, but to ask, are you still who you were, or have you become something else? The call came from my attorney. Elise, she said, her voice tight. You need to see this. And estate filing. Jonathan had passed away, an accident in the Alps, a ski trip with investors that ended in a landslide. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent his whole life climbing, only to be buried by the mountain he loved most. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated either. Just quiet. But what came next was stranger still. He left you something, my attorney said. Not money. A journal. I hesitated. Why? She paused. I think he knew you'd want to understand. It arrived a week later, bound in leather, corners worn. Inside, page after page of admissions. Regrets. Manipulations mapped out like confessions in slow motion. He had known more than I thought. How I moved the assets. How I rewrote the deed. How I slowly peeled away the scaffolding of our life together until only the shell remained. He hadn't stopped me. Not because he didn't notice, but because, in some twisted way, he admired it. You beat me at my own game. One entry read. And I deserved it. There was an entry from the night the bank took the house. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She asked if this was the only asset I forgot to secure. And I knew then I was never the one in control. And finally, this. If this ends badly, and you ever read this, I hope you don't think I hated you. I envied you. You were everything I pretended to be. I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf. Not as a memento, but as a record. A reminder that even the ones who diminish you sometimes know exactly what they're doing, and that silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. The ledger had reopened not to rewrite the past, but to acknowledge its truth. And I, who had once been written off, was now the author of every chapter that followed. It started happening more often: interviews, articles, podcasts. The media had caught on. Not just to the silent ledger, but to the quiet phenomenon it had sparked, a wave of financial independence among women who had once felt trapped in gilded cages. And, inevitably, the question would come. So, Elise, what happened with your husband? They always asked gently, with a practiced softness, the kind journalists use when poking around an old wound. I never flinched. I'd tell the truth, but not the scandal. Not the betrayal or the debts or the villas. No, I told the truth beneath it all. He underestimated me, I would say simply. He built his life assuming I would never leave. That usually ended the question. Because it wasn't about him. Not anymore. The story wasn't about his downfall. It was about what rises after something falls apart. But once, at a private conference in Zurich, a young woman followed me into the hallway after a panel. She looked barely 30, still wearing the wide eyes of someone who had only recently stopped believing every promise made to her. Can I ask you something real? She said. I nodded. Do you ever miss him? I exhaled slowly. I miss the idea of who I thought he was, I said. Not the man himself. That was the truest answer I had ever given. Because love, when it fails you, doesn't vanish all at once. It decays. It peels back slowly until all that remains is a skeleton of who you were trying to be for someone who never truly looked at you. But mourning the illusion is still mourning. And that's what I did in the early days of the villa, not cry for Jonathan, but grieve the woman who stayed too long in silence. The woman who had once believed her value depended on his validation. I no longer needed his name, his apology, or even his memory to justify my strength. But I honored the parts of me that had loved him once. The girl who brought him coffee during late-night strategy meetings. The woman who believed she was building something real. She deserved my compassion, not my contempt. Because without her, I would never have become the woman the world now asked questions of. Not to relive the past, but to learn how to walk out of it, head high, ledger balanced. I found the photo while sorting old files on a forgotten USB stick tucked in a box of notebooks from my early 20s. It was taken at a company holiday party, Jonathan's firm, before it all began to unravel. In it, I was laughing, head tilted, eyes bright, hand resting lightly on Jonathan's sleeve. I looked hopeful. I stared at that image for a long time, tracing the soft edges of a woman who didn't yet know what silence could cost, or how power could be hidden beneath passivity. She hadn't yet learned that sometimes survival doesn't look like fighting, it looks like studying, saving, planning your escape behind a smile. Part of me wanted to reach through the image and warn her. But another part, the wiser part, knew she wouldn't have listened. She believed in love. She believed in partnership. She believed that patience would earn her a seat at the table she was expected to set, but never sit at. I don't resent her for that. She was me, before I became my own rescue. I printed the photo and placed it in a frame on the bookshelf beside my law and finance texts. Not to romanticize the past, but to remind myself, every fortress begins with a single stone. Every powerful woman starts somewhere, often as a girl whose voice was made small so others could feel big. The world had taught me to diminish that girl, to call her naive, foolish, too trusting. But I see her differently now. She was loyal in a way few understood. She endured what others would have fled. She believed, even when belief was costly. And that kind of heart? It doesn't make you weak. It makes you whole. So I keep her there not as a cautionary tale, but as a monument. A reminder that even before I knew how to fight with spreadsheets and deeds, I had strength. Quiet. Devoted. Unshakable. She got me through the worst of it. And when the time came, she let me go. It came unexpectedly, a letter. Not from Jonathan this time, but from his estate attorney. Inside was a formal notice detailing the remains of his holdings, which were, unsurprisingly, in ruins. But there was a surprise clause at the end. Jonathan had left something for my future children. Not for me. Not for my beloved wife, or dear Elise. But for the children we never had. The children I used to imagine, once, before the silence and the weight of his control made the idea feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. He had designated a trust. I laughed, bitter and soft. Even in death, he was playing games with money and legacy. I showed the letter to no one. Instead, I drove to the edge of the vineyard I'd acquired quietly the year before, a patch of rolling green just beyond the villa, purchased with dividends and deliberate patience. I stood at the top of the hill, watching the rows of vines snake like sentences across a page. I thought about inheritance, not in terms of wealth, but of wounds. Of stories passed down like heirlooms. Women who were told, be small, be grateful, be pretty, be quiet. And men who believed ownership and love were synonyms. I didn't want children out of fear that I'd recreate the prison I had escaped. But now, I wasn't afraid of that anymore. I hadn't just left a man. I'd left a lineage of silence. And I had built something no one could take away. Not a house. Not a fund. A foundation. If I had children someday, they would know what strength looks like, not in shouting or domination, but in measured exits, in quiet planning, in rebuilding when no one claps. They would know their mother was the woman no one expected to win, and who didn't just win, but rewrote the rules entirely. Jonathan's final gesture wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. And I accepted it, not for the money, not for him, but as evidence that even the most powerful illusions must someday bow to truth. Not everyone left. Not every woman with a silent ledger walks away. Some stay. Some fold their pain into the seams of their lives like a hemline taken in too tightly. And when I began speaking publicly, not just behind encrypted logins and closed-door seminars, I met them. The women who stayed. They'd approach quietly, always with a different expression. Not admiration. Not resentment. Something else. Grief. Grief for what they'd given up. One woman lingered after a financial literacy event in Marseille. Her makeup was flawless, her pearls were real, her voice gentle. "My husband is still alive," she said. "Still rich. Still cruel." I nodded. I knew the type. "I can't leave," she continued. "Not yet. My youngest is 10. I have no career. My name isn't on the house." I looked her in the eye. "Then don't leave." "Not yet. But prepare. Every day. Quietly. Strategically." She exhaled like I'd given her permission to exist inside her reality. And that became part of my work too, not just for the ones ready to escape, but for the ones still surviving. Because leaving is a privilege that not all of us can grab at the same moment. And pretending otherwise is cruelty disguised as empowerment. So I created a second track inside the silent ledger, Fortify. It didn't promise freedom overnight. It didn't whisper lies about quick exits or fairy tale reinventions. It taught them how to build while staying, how to protect, preserve, and prepare without burning down their lives prematurely. I taught them how to be invisible and invincible at the same time. Because I remember those days, the ones where I still smiled beside Jonathan at cocktail parties while calculating how long I needed before my exit was airtight. I hadn't been brave. I had been ready. And readiness is often mistaken for weakness by those who never had to wait. So for the women who stayed, I gave them something else. A map. A match. Not to force an escape, but to remind them the door will open, and when it does, you will already have the key. The internet loves a comeback. Headlines with words like triumph and empire were attached to my name now, as if the villa and the program and the poised interviews told the whole story. But here's what they don't show. Rebuilding isn't glamorous. It's not champagne at closing tables or silk robes on Sunday mornings. It's spreadsheets at 2 a.m. because a grant application is due. It's crying over a broken water heater because you've already stretched the budget and you're too tired to fix one more thing. It's doubting yourself in the quiet moments, wondering if all of this was worth it, if the price of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. They don't show how I sat on the cold tile floor of the villa one winter morning, still wearing last night's clothes, poring over legal codes to help a client whose husband had locked her out of their accounts. They don't show the day I stood in the rain outside a notary's office, holding the deed to my vineyard with trembling hands, not from joy, but from exhaustion. And they certainly don't show the hours I spent in therapy, unlearning the idea that my worth was attached to my productivity or performance. But that's what rebuilding really is. It's slow. It's unphotogenic. It's gritty and thankless and quietly holy. Every tile repaired. Every document signed. Every meeting where I used my own name, not his. Every woman I helped not because I had to, but because I knew what it meant to feel like your life belonged to someone else. That's the work that mattered. The world saw the silent ledger and called it success. I saw it and called it sanctuary. Not just for me, but for all the women who had ever whispered I don't know how to leave and found in my story something stronger than permission. A plan. There was a room in the old house I never used, Jonathan's study. Dark wood, heavy curtains, the smell of aged paper and cigar smoke clinging to the walls. He once joked that it was his kingdom, a place where big decisions were made and women rarely understood the stakes. I remember standing outside it once, listening to the low murmur of his voice on a call, the way it dropped when talking money or manipulation. I wasn't supposed to hear. I wasn't supposed to know. So I stood quietly, memorizing tone, timing, everything. But I never stepped inside, not out of fear, out of discipline. because I knew the day would come when I wouldn't need access to his room. I'd build my own. And I did. In the villa, there's a sunlit space with arched windows and high ceilings, filled with white boards, open ledgers, and soft jazz playing low in the background. It smells like rosemary and ambition. That is my room now. No secrets. No hierarchy. Just strategy. And I keep a single chair across from my desk, always open, always ready. Not for Jonathan, but for the women who come here, unsure of their next move. They sit down with eyes full of questions, hands shaking over documents they don't yet understand. And I pour them tea, hand them a pen, and say, "Let's begin." I walk them through valuations, through prenups and postnups and trusts buried in toxic marriages. I translate the financial Latin their partners use to confuse them. I show them where the exits are and how to secure them. And often, when we're done, they cry. Not because it's sad, because they finally feel seen. Jonathan built a study where he shut the door. I built one where the door stays open. Because power hoarded is just control. But power shared? That's revolution. There's a myth about freedom, that once you attain it, everything becomes light and effortless. That the weight lifts, the sky clears, and you float into your new life, unburdened. It's a lie dressed in hopeful language. Because peace, real peace, has a cost. You lose people. Not just the ones who harmed you, but the ones who liked you better broken. Friends who only called when you were apologizing. Family members who tolerated your ambition when it stayed in check, but grew cold when it became self-sustaining. Some said I changed, as if I was meant to stay small just to make them comfortable. Success has made you hard, one cousin wrote after reading an article about me. No. Survival made me hard. Success made me sovereign. And sovereignty, by definition, requires boundaries. The kind that don't bend just because someone shares your last name. I no longer explain myself at holidays. I no longer soften the truth to make others feel less guilty. I no longer entertain the myth that silence is maturity. I learned that peace isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's a firm no. Sometimes it's walking away from a room full of people who cheered louder when you were struggling. It's learning to say, "No, I won't fund that. No, I won't come to that. No, I don't owe you access to the version of me you preferred." And yes, this solitude is worth it. Every moment of it. Because now I sleep with the windows open. I wake up when I want. I work with purpose, not permission. And when I sit alone with my coffee, I don't feel the need to perform for anyone. That is peace. And yes, it cost me, but everything I lost was never truly mine. It took 2 years after the divorce for my mother to visit the villa. She arrived with a gift basket, olive oil, soap, a jar of fig preserves, and the uncertain eyes of someone who had watched her daughter transform into something unfamiliar. She was wearing pearls, the ones Jonathan gave her on their first shared Christmas. We sat on the terrace, surrounded by sun and silence. "This is lovely," she said, carefully. "Different." "Yes," I replied. That was the point. She stirred her tea slowly. "You've become so capable." It wasn't a compliment. Not exactly. Growing up, she had taught me how to be likable, not formidable. She coached me in manners, not money. She celebrated when I hosted flawlessly, not when I negotiated fiercely. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. She looked up, finally meeting my eyes. "You used to lean on people. Now you don't need anyone." I smiled. "I needed too many people for too long," I said. "Now I choose who I trust." There was a pause. A long one. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I thought Jonathan would protect you." I didn't respond. Because what she meant was, I thought if you married well, you wouldn't have to fight this hard. But she didn't understand. It was precisely because I married him that I had to fight. And in doing so, I discovered the truth. No man can protect a woman he doesn't respect. And no woman should wait for protection when she can build her own fortress. We didn't speak of the inheritance, or the journal, Or the programs I built that had helped hundreds of women. She asked about the garden instead. I told her about the lavender, the fig tree, the lemon grove. She nodded. It suits you. And I think, in that moment, she saw me not as the daughter she raised, but as the woman I chose to become. Not someone new. Someone reclaimed. 6 months after Jonathan's estate was closed, a collection of his remaining assets went to auction. Art, watches, collector's items. Most were overvalued, symbols of a man who believed ownership equaled worth. I didn't plan to go. But I did. Not to buy. Just to watch. It was held at a sleek gallery in London. High ceilings, crystal lighting. Patrons in tailored suits murmuring over catalogs, eyes trained on relics they'd later call investments. One of the featured pieces was a painting Jonathan had once claimed was the jewel of his collection. He'd bought it after closing a major deal, framed it in imported wood, and hung it above the mantel like a trophy. I stood at the back, unnoticed, as the bidding began. Paddle after paddle lifted. Prices climbed. When it sold, applause rippled through the room, modest, transactional. That was Jonathan's world. Celebrating the win, not the meaning. I stepped into the side hall and looked at the rest of the pieces. Some familiar. Most not. All reminders of a man who valued optics more than intimacy. But something strange happened. A woman approached me, hesitant. Elise Whitmore? Yes. I knew him. Briefly. Years ago. I waited. I just wanted to say, whatever he was chasing, you clearly found it first. Then she was gone. No explanation. No further words. Just that quiet observation, dropped like a stone into still water. I left without buying a thing. Because nothing in that room could match what I'd already claimed. Not wealth, but clarity. Not art. Architecture. A life I had rebuilt not from ambition, but from survival. The only bidding I cared for now was with myself, every day deciding what peace was worth and paying in full. There was a time when my name had always been said second. Elise, Jonathan's wife. Elise, married to Jonathan Whitmore. Even in circles where I did the work, the numbers, the unseen management, his name wrapped itself around mine like ivy, slowly suffocating but looking elegant from the outside. After I left, after I built, after I rose, I reclaimed my name fully. Not as Elise Whitmore, ex-wife. Not as Elise, the woman who survived. Simply, Elise. At one of my first keynote conferences, ironically hosted by one of Jonathan's former partners, they introduced me without titles, without footnotes. Elise, founder of the Silent Ledger. The applause was different. It wasn't the polite kind reserved for spouses or the dutiful clapping offered to women who've overcome sad stories. It was respect, recognition, acknowledgement of the work itself. Later that evening, one of the board members approached me. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "Not just in business. In identity." I smiled. "The hardest part isn't leaving," I replied. "It's untangling yourself from who people decided you were supposed to be." He nodded. "And now?" "Now," I said, "I decide." That's what reclaiming my name meant. Not erasing my past. Not rewriting the story to make myself look invincible. But owning it. Completely. Because I had failed. I had been silenced. I had made compromises I now know I should not have made. And still, here I stood. Not as a victim. Not even as a victor. As myself. Fully formed. Fully owned. The quietest triumph is not revenge. It's becoming exactly who they said you could never be and needing no one's permission to stay there. By now, the Silent Ledger had grown into something larger than I ever imagined. Women came from all over, executives, doctors, artists, teachers, even women who had married into old money families where wealth was power and power was silence. One morning, my assistant forwarded me a new intake form. The woman's name was Caroline. She was in her late 40s, married to a man eerily similar to Jonathan, successful, charming, respected. She wrote, "I have access to none of our accounts. He says money confuses me. I have 2 children in private school and no idea what happens if I ask too many questions. I scheduled a private session. When she arrived at the villa, I saw it instantly, that polished surface masking years of internal erosion. The perfect posture, the careful words, the constant scanning of her own sentences, as if she was still calculating how much truth was safe to say. I poured her tea, like I always did. "You've done nothing wrong," I said softly. "You're here. That's already power." She exhaled sharply, as though releasing years of tension in one breath. Over the next few hours, we went through her situation. Accounts solely in his name. A prenup written by his family's attorney. Hidden assets disguised under shell companies. Emotional manipulation layered with financial dependency. As we worked, she whispered something that caught me. "He says I wouldn't survive without him." I paused. "That's the first lie they tell us," I said. "And often the one they believe themselves. Because men like Jonathan and Caroline's husband depended on our self-doubt more than on their own financial acumen. They knew our love would keep us silent. They knew our loyalty would keep us small. Until one day, it didn't. By the end of our sessions, Caroline had a plan. A secured personal account. Copies of every document. A quiet legal team. The early architecture of her own freedom. She wasn't ready to leave yet. But she would be. And when she finally walked down the villa's stone path, she turned back and whispered, "I never thought someone like you would understand." I smiled. "I only exist because I do. Because I had been her. And now I help build exits for women like us. Exits so sturdy, no man would dare call them mistakes."